Good morning, everybody. I'm Rob McCargo. I'm Director of AI at PwC. Absolutely thrilled to be here leading this business AI ethics track. We've got a fantastic session. We've got some brilliant speakers. One thing I'd love everyone to do who is active on social media is tweet the hell out of this session using the hashtag AI ethics. But also, what I wanted to do is make sure that everyone's really participating, bringing some great questions to bear. We're going to have a fairly interactive session. I don't want to just preach from the front with our great speakers. We want to involve everybody. We'll do that by calling people out as well from the audience. But we would also love people to partake on Slido. So if people are on Slido, the most important thing to do is click on Breakout 3, just to confuse things. So Breakout 3 is where I'm going to be collecting Slido questions for this session. But without further ado, we've got a fairly limited time plan, and we're working a little bit behind schedule. To start things off, I'd like to welcome one of our sponsors, Riccardo Masucci, who's Global Director of Privacy Policy at Intel, who will start us off with a keynote speech. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob, for your introduction, and thanks to techUK for the opportunity to present here today. I'm the Global Director of Privacy Policy at Intel, and so in this capacity, I try to look at the interplay between privacy and technologies. Today, we have a limited time. We are running a little bit behind schedule, so I'll try to squeeze part of the contents of this presentation and try to go fast. What I would like to do is looking at some technology trends that I find crucial in the debate on ethical data processing. And I would like also to spend some time in sharing with you what Intel is doing in terms of ethics and our policy focus on artificial intelligence. And in particular, I would like to walk you through some of the contents of the paper that we published a couple of months ago on artificial intelligence and privacy. So without further delay, if we look at the data-intensive society we live in, I think there are two technology trends that are particularly interesting. The fact that data analytics is happening increasingly across the infrastructure, which means at the edge, on the network, in the data centers, and these three elements feed each other. And the second technology trend that I find very interesting is the fact that personal data is not just collected and shared by individuals, but increasingly sensors are gathering personal data, and algorithms are inferring or deriving personal data of individuals. And so in this scenario, it's important to think about the ability and the increased capabilities of processing data for artificial intelligence to come up with autonomous decisions, autonomous determinations. And so the big difference and also the big reasons why, the most important reason why privacy is different in an artificial intelligence world is the fact that these autonomous determinations brings incredible benefits to individuals, but at the same time there is a potential for harm for individuals. And harm can be discrimination, can be a restriction of choices, but can be also economic, physical, reputational damage to individuals. Keeping in mind the existence of this risk for harm to individuals, Intel has acknowledged the importance of being an ethical company, and which means trying to pursue at the same time innovation and increasing protection for citizens and technology users. So we think we did it right in committing to a number of programs and activities over the years to show our responsibility. And this translates into programs for responsible sourcing. Conflict-free minerals is a great example, programs for diversity and inclusion in our workforce, and a number of environmental programs linked to water saving or waste reduction, and so on. Today, we are engaged in the AI and ethics discussion in a number of fora and multi-stakeholders organizations around the world, including also standard organizations where we are trying to develop also algorithm explainability techniques and voluntary standards for achieve this. Another important point that I wanted to make is the importance of investing in research, and especially in those techniques that can really serve privacy, security, ethics. There's a number of interesting techniques from face anonymization to homomorphic encryption, for instance, is a very, very promising area of research at the moment, and where Intel is investing a lot of resources. In 2000, okay, this slide doesn't look very nice on PDF, but with this slide, I just wanted to show the 5 different workflows we identified in 2016 when Intel acquired a number of AI companies, and we really started making business on artificial intelligence. So you see that for the true deployment and development of artificial intelligence technologies, we think that there are 5 buckets, 5 priorities, 5 areas where we should focus from a policy perspective. So innovation, employment, data, privacy and security, and ethics. And in my role, I work a lot on privacy, security, and ethics discussions. And this is the reason why we published this paper less than 2 months ago. You can find it on our policy blog online. So today, I want also to share with you some of the policy recommendations that we made in this paper. The first one, and I found very inspiring the comments made by Minister James earlier, that we need to create a policy and regulatory environment that is favorable and positive for the development of artificial intelligence. Comprehensive privacy laws, for instance, can be an interesting tool, especially because they encompass the current data uses, but can also be neutral to future data uses that are not foreseen at the moment. Another important aspect is the fact of promoting cross-border data flows. We don't want just large data sets to make AI effective and successful, but we need also very diverse data sets. And the fact that we can move data across borders, this is just an opportunity to enhance our ability to have better AI. Second point is embracing risk-based accountability. And this is a call for industry and all like-minded organizations that think that we need to take a responsible approach, to take measures proactively to minimize and mitigate risks for individuals, that arm that I was referring earlier. And so 2 interesting examples in my view are embedding privacy and ethical considerations and reviews throughout the product development process. And this is something that Intel has done, and we have taken proactive steps in the past few years. Third point, and probably one of the most important discussions at the moment, is how we explain the logic behind the decisions made by the machines. And as we speak, there are ongoing efforts to find solutions, technical solutions to algorithm explainability. On the one hand, we think that we should not limit automated decision making, and we should find also accountable approaches to make sure that we can use and leverage automated decision making. At the same time, we need to increase the level of safeguards for individuals so that consumers can trust, citizens can trust technology. Algorithm explainability, I said, is probably one of the top priorities, but I would say we need to have a deeper reflection also on the possibility to have human oversight on autonomous determinations. And so we came up with the idea of risk-based degrees of human intervention, which means that depending on the context of use for AI, we can think of human intervention at different levels. And so if you take industry control systems that just detect defective products, I don't think we necessarily want to question the decision taken by a machine. But if the decision taken by the algorithms relates to a job selection or a medical treatment that is granted to a patient, well, we might want to ensure a human intervention in this decision-making process. Fourth point, and very, very important, and it was mentioned also by the representative of the Lovelace Institute earlier today, the importance of access to data. There are a number of initiatives that governments could take to improve the situation, but I would like to focus especially on the promotion of diversity. A colleague from Microsoft mentioned earlier the importance of having a diverse team of developers in order to minimize the risk for biases in algorithms. But another very important point for us is the diversity of data sets. Take some applications like AI for medicine. You want to be sure that the data set that is used to train the algorithm is diverse and represent the whole spectrum of population, including all the small ethnical minorities. And so to be sure that the algorithm is reliable, the algorithm is effective, we need to make sure that we can also move data from other countries to the country where we develop the algorithm. And so again, cross-border data flows we think is extremely important. More investments in research and especially in data security. I mentioned homomorphic encryption as a very promising area where we are investing a lot of resources. And last point is the fact that we can use AI to improve AI. And so we can use AI to detect biases, we can use AI to detect cyber threats, we can use AI to detect identity theft. And if we will have time during the panel, it would be nice also to explore the importance of authenticity of personhood in the age of AI. So here in this slide you have a summary of all our recommendations, so I won't go through all of them again. What I think it's what these recommendations actually are helpful for us to look at the conclusions of my short presentation. What organizations, public-private organizations, can do to ensure that they are actually applying ethics in practice. $1 million question. There are no easy answers to hard questions. First thing, organizations should acknowledge the importance of an innovative and ethical use of data, innovative and ethical design of products. Second important point in my view is the cooperation between policymakers, regulators, and industry, consumer groups, to make sure that there is a technology and policy environment that allows for accessing, moving, and at the same time protecting personal data. And third point is accountability. I already mentioned this. I think that it's of paramount importance that organizations like Intel, but the overall industry ecosystem, takes proactive steps to embed in the design of products responsible approaches, ethical privacy, and ethical reviews of these processes. And having said that, I think I took already a lot of your time. Thanks a lot for your attention. You can find the paper at this address, and you can ping me on my email or Twitter. Thank you very much.
Stand there. Just a quick question. There's been a kind of an outbreak of ethics boards being discussed at the moment, and one of the big complaints about them is that sometimes they're so opaque nobody knows who's on them. So in Intel's ethics boards, who's actually on these boards?
So we are we need to work with senior management for any kind of ethical review process within Intel. We are in the process of building a formal board for that. There is already a committee for compliance and ethics that is actually looking at new technologies and processes when they come up. So the importance is to have representatives from different business units, from different regions, because one of the issue or one of the main concerns around ethics is that we need to have a comprehensive view of what is ethics in the different regions of the world. And as a global company, we feel the responsibility of understanding what is ethics around the world.
Very good. Thanks very much, Ricardo.
Thanks.
If you could join us on seat 2, and if I could welcome my illustrious panel up to the front as well, please. And if you could attempt to do it in the following order with, I think, Ivana here, Matteo next. I think we're getting there. Well, who needs AI? We need number 3 on Slido, so start filling my iPhone with questions as soon as possible, please. Okay, we've got some fantastic people to talk to here today. Let me just very quickly introduce you all. You've heard from Ricardo already. Next on the panel is Ivana Bartoletti, Head of Data Protection and Privacy at GemServe. Next to Ivana is Matteo Bellucci, who's CEO of YourMD, followed by Emma Wright of Kemp Little and Anna Perales of Barclays. Someone said, isn't the state of AI in Italy doing really well at the moment? We've got an illustrious panel, and I think Luciano Floridi coming along later on, so we're looking good.
The new renaissance.
Indeed, yeah, new renaissance. Just to kick things off, we've heard from Ricardo, fantastic opening talk there, Ivana. If I could just move on to you, just to sort of think through the vast number of competing demands that business leaders are facing at the moment, and how do we ensure that this very specific issue of the prioritization of emerging tech ethics is uppermost in business leaders' minds? How do we ensure that happens?
Yeah, thank you. So thanks for this, and it was really good to listen to fellow Italian just now. So I would start by saying this. It's been really interesting working with businesses across all sectors. I don't know if you felt the same, but it's been really interesting over the last year. I head up the privacy and data protection practice in the consultancy firm at GemServe, and it's been really interesting working with organizations and seeing the shift over the last year or so in terms of wanting to do the right thing. And GDPR definitely has changed the perception, because organizations have started to say, well, actually, I do have to do things in the right way. I do have to. And now with ethics becoming such an important topic, now businesses are starting to say, yes, how do I turn this into practice? And they do want to prioritize an ethical approach to innovation. So that has been a big change that I've seen. And that's very important and reassuring. Now, in terms of ethics, a lot of companies I work with, they want to have an ethics by design approach. And the first discussion that we have is, well, what is it? You know, what is ethics? And this is, I think, the key issue, because we're all talking about ethics, but who is defining what ethics is? And this issue, I think, comes before anything else, because we've seen, as part of initiatives, fantastic principles, the companies that are dominating the digital market are the ones actually defining what ethics is, which has got its limitations as well. So I always say to organizations, well, stop for a moment and define what ethics is in your own terms. And once you've done that, communicate it. Because this is, I think, the first step for organizations. So decide what it is, decide who is deciding what ethics is, and if it's a public sector organization, then sometimes I say to them, I said, well, you may want to open a discussion about it. If you're a local government organization, you may want to involve your citizens in defining what ethics is and what are the underpinning principles of your ethical approach. And if you are a private sector business, then I always say, you have to make clear that you don't have just an opaque ethics sort of commission, but you do a process where you involve your customers, you involve your users, because defining what ethics is the number one thing. And I think that's very important. Now, some organizations, they are going down the route of saying, yes, I understand there's a really strong competitive advantage to adopt an ethics by design approach. And it is, especially because of what we've seen over the last year or so with Cambridge Analytica, with Facebook, and with the data breaches that we've seen. Of course, a lot of businesses are starting to say, I really want, I know it's a competitive advantage. And that's good, isn't it? Because we are going somewhere. So they are starting to say, let's create a sort of an ethical framework. And I would actually start with that. So what ethics means for your business? What are the key principles underpinning it? Who is deciding what ethics is? And then once that's done, I think it's really important to communicate it, to let people know, customers know, about what is driving the ethics by design approach. The second thing is, I work on algorithmic impact assessment. So when a company decides to start using AI, is assessing the algorithm that they use. Now, that's not an easy process because a company would have loads of algorithms. So it's about deciding, so in your algorithmic impact assessment, it's about saying, well, what are you assessing the algorithm against? And we've heard a lot, even sort of now and earlier, in relation, for example, we assess it against bias, fairness. How do we make sure that the automated decisions or doesn't produce a bias on an unfair outcome? How do we make sure that we don't produce a decision whereby we turn a stereotype into then a prejudice, because this is the problem of bias in algorithms. But also, there is the wider issue around transparency, which Matteo mentioned before, transparency and how we communicate with users. That's a very important issue. And this is where we have a little bit of a huge question mark around GDPR, because the GDPR says that organizations have to provide meaningful information, and we don't know the extent of it, meaningful information, when automated decisions have a legal effect on somebody. Now, I always say to organizations, please interpret this as wider as possible. Meaningful information means you have to decide how much you want to provide. And of course, that depends on the context. Every context is different. A medical sector is very different from a insurance company deciding on a premium, or a bank deciding where they're having an automated process to decide whether you have access to a loan or not. They're very different contexts, but the meaningful information is important. And providing, I always say, the end user, to a possibility to say what would need to change in the criteria for me to obtain a different outcome. To me, that's a very good explanation of transparency. Yep. And the ability for a data subject to be able to question and to challenge, and also even before questioning, but to be offered the possibility to say, this decision the outcome would be different if these parameters had been different in the first place. And the third element of all this, I think, is around the significant, the legal effect. And now this is also, I think, where we have a little bit of discussions. Now, in the public sector, it's obvious where, for example, you have predictive technology that has an impact on the individual. For example, some local authorities are deploying algorithm to for example, assess the so the children that could be a risk, or in healthcare, you could have algorithms to look at particular predicting particular circumstances to happen. So in that case, to me, that is a significant effect on the individuals, because the impact that it has, particularly in the criminal justice system, is huge. But there are other things also that have a significant effect. And to me, that goes all the way down to digital advertising and something like that.
Well, let's just pick on that particular point around healthcare. One of the sectors that's received a huge amount of focus and scrutiny, and opprobrium, rightly so, this year. With Matteo here, I mean, briefly, if you could just introduce your MD quickly, but specifically address some of those healthcare considerations. I know there's many people in the room interested in that, judging by the questions.
Thanks, Rob. So yes, your MD, I set it up almost 4 years ago. And the aim is to use artificial intelligence to try to bridge the gap, the knowledge gap between us, we're all patients and human beings, and the medical profession. As you know, we have this huge asymmetry of knowledge, and we also have a massive demand and supply problem with perfect demand and very limited supply. So what I wanted to tell you is to share with you some of our experiences, because as a startup, you're very lucky because you can define your own things. You have a clean sheet, so you have no, you don't have to report to the stock exchange every quarter, and you can do whatever you like. And so we've been working for this for 4 years, so I think we're probably a couple of years ahead of the curve. And in terms of ethics, as the MP Margot James said earlier on, the ethics of AI are or should be very similar to the ethics in medicine. And so we do medicine and AI, so obviously we're lucky to be at the kind of at the junction point. So a year and a half ago, I realized that as a startup, we had to invest in the ethics side of things, because I started asking myself the question that I knew would have come up in business when I was sitting in a meeting with a potential partner, whether it was the NHS or a health insurer. And so I started asking myself, okay, what these people will expect? Where is this data coming from? How do we know that the data we use is clean, is not biased, is reliable? And so the first thing, I'll tell you practically what we've done, because we're not a big corporation, we do things like all startups. So the first thing I did was to put in place a clinical advisory board, which you can consider as an ethics board, and comprising external people. Because you have to have external people from the company, because otherwise you end up in your echo chamber. And how can you make sure that you are honest with yourself? So I hired a group of very distinguished clinicians.
Are they open to see on your website?
Yeah, they are. We have Dr. Mark Davis, who's the CMO of IBM Europe and IBM Watson. We have Professor Maureen Baker, who was the chair of the Royal College of GPs. We have some professors from Oxford, and so on. So these people sit on this board, and basically they keep us honest. Because as a startup, you're very tempted to go in all directions. So these guys, we meet every quarter, and we tell them what our plans are, and they essentially inject all the experience of clinical safety into the business. The second thing we did was to create a clinical risk management process, which didn't exist. It doesn't exist for digital companies. And I realized that and this is for the transparency and the accountability, because we thought, what happens if a child or somebody uses our app and they get in trouble? They're going to probably sue us. So if I'm standing up in court, I need to be able to say, well, we came up with this conclusion because of this process. So we implemented a clinical risk management process under the guidance of Professor Maureen Baker, which we plan to publish soon. With that, we got the CE mark as a medical device class 1, which were one of the first AI apps in the world to achieve it back in the spring of this year. Then we got I kind of believe that you need to have external people to validate what you do. I use the analogy with PwC doing the audit of your financial accounts. You can't say that your finances are in order. You have to get somebody else to tell you. And in AI, I find surprising that still today, nobody has external validators. People say, oh yeah, we use this data set and this and that. But who tells me that you actually done it properly? So we announced back in the spring the first deal of this type with the British Medical Journal. So we started working on an external auditing process for AI data sets. Then we also got an e-privacy seal from a German company that assesses all your data protection policies, again, to get us an external party to validate it. And so these things, and we did obviously GDPR to the 10th degree, because you need to be whiter than white.
Yeah.
And then what this meant for us from a business, I think we spent 25% of our resources in the last 18 months on this, which for a startup is huge. We should be focusing on building the product and doing marketing. But this became an extremely strategic decision, because today I can sit in business discussions with blue chip companies, and I know we tick not all the boxes, but most of the boxes. And if you don't tick the boxes, you're not going to be able to do business with these people, because at the third question, you're going to fall flat on your face.
Very good. Well, it's encouraging to know there's a future of the audit profession there, and all those forecasting the end of lawyers as well, Emma. Maybe disappointed.
Nah, we love lawyers.
It seems like we're going to need your expertise more than ever. We heard from Ivana just briefly touching on some of the legal aspects here. What's top of your worry list or concern list in your profession, Emma?
I'm not going to say the B word, because that's really going to be a nightmare. So from an external perspective with our clients, we are finding that GCs more and more are being treated as an ethics sound. They're expected to guide on what the right decision is, as opposed to what the legally correct position is. So, and where you find that point very much depends on the company as well and what they're involved in. It's really interesting. What's happened with GDPR is basically data and the protection of data has become the equivalent of health and safety risks. So for bricks and mortar companies, so some of those companies that I act for are more bricks and mortar, but have done their GDPR compliance. And what they've said is you basically, it's now a health and safety issue. So if you've got 3,000 men driving around with forklifts, you've always been very aware of the damages that can be caused. Data is that kind of level of risk. So what are people?
Data is a new forklift.
Yeah, well, basically, yeah. I mean, we could go with that. I'm sure that will get a hashtag. But from the legal profession's perspective, so I obviously advise on emerging tech, things like connectivity, monetizing ones and zeros. Monetizing ones and zeros is always more difficult, I think, now post-GDPR, and also what do we want to do with that? What should we be doing with it? What does our data protection impact assessment conclude? So, you know, those things are all very much there. From the legal profession perspective, everyone talks about how AI will get rid of lawyers, and I look at our use of machine learning for improving client delivery. And so we have played around, there's a group of us that played around with various third-party solutions and delivered Brexit and GDPR-enabled tools. So it scans contracts, comes up with the key clauses that you need to look at. Now, to be able, when we trained it ourselves, a couple of things. Data sets are a nightmare. Lawyers, all of a sudden the junior lawyers change their role. Now we can't do, well, let's be clear, these tools are not good enough to scrap lawyers. They just, you know, that will not happen. We need someone to step in, but it also changes the nature of the legal profession. And that's a difficult conversation to have with people that are coming in. So.
And Anna, is it the end of bankers as well? Or seriously, I mean, obviously, I think our analysis suggests that financial services has been at the front of the pack here in terms of investment and legacy innovation around AI applications, algorithmic trading, etc. Yeah. How are Barclays and other institutions leading the way around this?
Well, one of the aspects that I wanted to touch on based on what you just said around the changing in the law profession is our take on AI is obviously it's the fourth industrial revolution as we all describe it. But actually the challenge here for banks and for all of the industries is how do we actually help everybody involved understand what AI can do, cannot do, and how it does it without making everybody a data scientist. Yeah. So that's, you know, and that's one of the, I'm not talking generically, that is actually part of my agenda. So how do we work collaborative across industry sectors, but also with universities and with policymakers to really understand what it is, but also the impact it has on people. Responding to your question around, you know, is it the end of bankers? Without actually doing it directly, one of the things that we really are looking at is where does this technology, but also any technology, help our colleagues? So to the point of a change in the role of some people, what we really need to do is where is the opportunity to augment our colleagues and actually make them more effective, more confident, and actually much more able to focus on the customer. So kind of my last point, and I've got some lessons learned as well in the progress that we've been doing, but is our starting point is the customer. So anything that we do has to be about helping the customer, meeting a customer need, resolving a customer pain point. And therefore, anything we look at from an artificial intelligence perspective is actually how does this technology deliver an outcome that is that we are confident will help the customer move forward. That's really the summary. So we can translate that into the principles of fairness, transparency, accountability, and reliability, which we have done. It is critical that in doing that and embedding those principles into all of the governance processes that you can imagine we have, we actually think about the combination of the business people and the technology people working together to drive the right outcome. And therefore, in that sense, we're always going to be needing business people. We're always going to need bankers because it's that expertise that combined with the technology is going to help us all make the most of this.
Thank you, Anna. And that sets us up beautifully to segue into some brilliant Slido questions coming through. I can see one burning its way right to the top. Christina Colclough here. How can we strengthen corporations' data and AI accountability and transparency towards their own workers and employees. And I think maybe your slide deck, Ricardo, touched upon some of that, of how you're considering that for the people, specifically your own staff. How are you protecting their privacy rights and from an ethical consideration?
Well, no, well, I wouldn't say so. But anyway, interesting to see how, for instance, I was involved in the past couple of years in our global program for adapting on to the GDPR requirements, and we did a lot of data mapping around that, data inventory, and so on. And Intel remains a manufacturing company, right? And so, even if we have shifted from a PC-centric to a more data-centric company, the biggest chunk of the data that we are processing are still data of our customers and data of our human resources, of our employees. So there are some lawyers that are working 100% of the time on HR issues within our company, and there are some privacy lawyers working actually with Works Council in the different countries where we have operations and we have big facilities. So a lot of work is done by the legal department. A lot of work is done also by the IT department. That has a number of privacy analysts that are also looking at all the applications and all the different programs that our employees, Intel employees, are using for their work. And so we avoid situations where some programs are too intrusive, or we avoid situations where the use of computers, might be monitored. Programs might monitor the work of each and every employee. So a lot of work is done also in terms of training, of internal training. So for employees also to be aware of what privacy is and which are their privacy rights. So I think it's an ongoing effort. There's always room for improvement, but I think that Intel has a solid position and experience on that.
I mean, many people in the room here and on the panel have been quite heavily involved in the UK scene with regards to things like the House of Lords Select Committee on AI. I know Havana's and a few others involved in that, and that brings to bear some of those needs to put AI codes in place. How do you ensure your workforce flourish alongside this technology? Of all the panels I've done this year, it's always been the red hot topics being around the ethics and then the workforce job skills education bucket as well. And how do you bring those two together? Havana, have you seen any companies on your travels that have really been doing that well, setting out their duty of care to their workforce and the people they look after?
Yeah, I mean, there's a key issue, isn't it, Rob? Because I always say to organizations that when you want to transform and you want to innovate using AI, then you can't do so without assessing the impact this is going to have on your workforce. And you have to bring your employees with you. You can't leave them behind. And it's really important to do that, and for two reasons. One is, of course, ethical, in terms of we have to have as a starting point that AI is going to augment our capabilities, and where it is going to replace jobs, then we have to take our employees with us. So if we are going to have to invest in retraining, then we have to do so as companies. And I always say you have to be very open and transparent about this. But the second issue here is that what we've seen in 2018 is about employees taking a public stand on these issues. I mean, we've seen it in the US, we've seen it with Google, we've seen it, we've seen employees really saying, we want our companies to make ethical decisions. I mean, the walkout at Google has been something. We've seen it across the US in 2018. Now, why am I saying this? Because I think when we talk about ethics, then we need to say clearly, and I always say when I work with organizations, we say, well, you have to do this. You have to make sure that when you assess an algorithm, when you assess a strategy and your artificial intelligence strategy within your company, you ask the question not just about transparency, not just about accountability, fairness and all that, but also what is the impact on the workforce and what is the impact on society. In the medical sector, this is extraordinary if you think about it. For example, one of the questions I always say in the medical sector is, if you are replacing a particular function with an algorithm, what's going to happen to medical knowledge? And how do you make sure that the workforce knowledge is up to date all the time? And probably in the legal sector, some questions like this will have to be asked.
Yep.
So I think it's about making sure that when you assess an algorithm, you put the big emphasis onto what is the impact on my employees and how do I bring my employees with me.
Very good. Two very interesting things this week. First of all, 2 days ago, Salesforce announced the appointment of what they call a Chief Ethical and Humane Use Officer. Paula Goldman, I'm sure we'll invite her next year. A CEO, I think they call these things on the C-suite now. I thought that's quite interesting, this creation of these new job titles. Did anyone else also see this interesting essay by Julia Powles talking about the bias aspects of ethics? And she pointed to 3 issues with regards to this. Addressing bias as a computational problem obscures its root problem because it's a social problem. Point 2 was even successful tackling of this leads to perverse consequences. So facial recognition of women of colour, for example, can lead to equalising the perfection of vast instruments of surveillance and classification. And finally, the seductive controversy of AI bias leads to a kind of a false level of assurance of solving AI. It detracts from the bigger, more pressing questions at hand. And the latest hot question on my Slido here from Anonymous is ethics just a business fad? Is it driven by worries about damaging their business model rather than a real commitment to transparency and diversity? Matteo, would you like to go on that one?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point because I think that, as Ivana was saying, when you look at ethics, you have to go back to the core root of what is the definition of ethics. And it's inevitably you have to define the values that you recognize yourself in. So as an individual, I think in life you have to know your values because they help you making decisions. When you're confronted with a situation with 2 options, if you're not clear on your values, you will struggle to know what is the right choice. And so why should that be different for a company? So I think it's fundamental for companies to first have a very clear set of values and then try to use the value set as a moral compass for the decisions. Now, this interestingly is going to go into AI for a simple reason. AI is, I'm a former computer scientist, and what's really to me AI is the introduction of fuzziness in computing. Before, computers were just doing one thing and giving you always the same result. Now you can have some randomness in the results, which is a bit more human in its randomness, but is essentially that's what's kind of happening. And so computers are starting to be used to take decisions, and that's where the ethics comes in, because the moment you take a decision, you basically need to say, what is your moral compass that you use to take that decision? And I think that this is exactly the same in society. And I just recently read Homo Deus by Yuval Harari. It's very interesting because it basically looks at the ethics framework. He has 3 points of view. It's either centered on you, the individual, is it centered on a group of people, the society, or is Darwinian. And so it depends on how you teach your AI, because you can teach your AI to favor people that are stronger and make them thrive, or you can have an AI that is designed to be more equalitarian, or you can have an AI that is very individualistic. So this starts from the people that create the frameworks. And I think we're going to see all 3 flavors. And we see in politics and society, we have these 3 approaches to ethics. I think they're going to have to, unfortunately, or fortunately, have them also in AI.
Indeed. And Emma, is this whole ethics washing thing, ethics is cool, ethics is a new green thing now, sort of permeating through the legal profession as well?
Always. Well, so we have, to me, it's not something that you would, integrity is one of the fundamental principles of being a lawyer. So, but the SRA is moving towards actually documenting that and setting out what that means. Why it feels the need to do that or not is obviously because they feel that some weren't around
Can I just, sorry to interrupt. The reason why ethics become important is because now, with the internet, there's nowhere to hide. That's the novelty. Before you can wash your dirty laundry at home. Now you have whistleblowers, you've got Twitter. So suddenly, every small mistake you make becomes immediately public. So, oops, everybody's realized that they need ethics because you need to be able to defend yourself.
What concerns me more is around the data sets, actually, that the data sets that are being used, that there is a bias built within them, but also the user interfaces that are being developed around the technology. Unless we have a diverse group developing them, then so Apple Pay, London Tube Station, I'm left-handed. You try and use your iPhone X and pay for Apple Pay. Sorry. You try and pay.
Enforced.
Yeah, you're there. So that's a really basic point.
Tried scissors.
Someone has but I'm in a minority being left-handed. It's not a new phenomena. You'd think people would accommodate it, but there has been no consideration made for it around travelling around London. And I get the point that there is an efficiency that makes sense for that to be prevailing, but this is just one tiny example, and where we're at a cusp of adopting new technologies that do or user interfaces that will promote one over another. The Darwinian theory, it's that.
Yeah. And that partly, Hilary Sutcliffe is in the audience as well, talking about the diversity of data sets based on historical data. Will there be bias because humans have historically behaved in biased ways? And how will we de-bias the data? The same applies to just creating tech before the days of AI. I think I can't see that there's any argument against the absolute pressing necessity for really good diverse workforces creating this tech.
Yes.
I can't see, no one's come at me on this, you know what I mean?
Rob, can I just say something though, and just following on this, I mean, it's true, and clearly there are technical processes that we can follow. So the diversity of the workforce, making sure that so the accuracy of the data sets, and also looking at the way
it's not just about accuracy of data sets.
No, of course.
It's the inbuilt bias.
It's the inbuilt bias.
It can be accurate, but if they reflect a certain proportion of the population, we're just compounding it.
Exactly, absolutely. So, and also not just the data sets, but also the process, because AI is not just about data sets, but also about the process that you follow. So that's one thing. But I have the feeling, and this is probably, Rob, what you were talking about before, I have the feeling that ethics is great, and it's good that we are putting so much emphasis onto it. However, it risks becoming what it was described before, like a PR exercise, if we don't understand that there is something beyond this, which is the fact that the first question that we have to ask ourselves is, do we need to use this algorithm or not? Even before we start assessing it and looking at the data sets, there is a question here, which is not because something is technologically possible means that we have to do it. So there is a question around what is AI for, and is this the right decision to innovate through AI in this particular way? And also, the algorithm and artificial intelligence in general, it does happen in what is already a biased outcome, where it's already a biased sort of structural and hierarchical, and already the decision on whether to deploy an algorithm or not is already the outcome of decisions that are made by sort of leadership in place in a particular organization. So I think we need to understand that the issue of ethics is wider than that. And this is, I think, where organizations can make the difference, which is, and this is why I said, we really need to understand what ethics is, and in order to do so, we need to have a participatory discussions around it. If we start embedding values into the machine, then the question is, who decides these values?
Sure.
And this is a major issue, and just saying we adopt ethics could be limiting if we don't do something a little bit more than that, which is really sitting down and say, okay, who is making these decisions? Who is deciding the ethical framework of our organization?
Yeah, and then back to that point of if you create this CEO person that sits in the corner,
exactly,
the ethics box off, we're okay now, we'll stick with what we've been doing for the last 2
And
years.
actually on that point precisely, when I started the journey around the kind of artificial intelligence, ethics principles, responsible principles, it doesn't even have to be called ethics. one of the angles we were looking at was, and we did actually seek external advice from the legal profession, what do you think we should do, etc., which is really much more of a collaboration effort.
Yeah.
But actually, to the point of an ethics board, one of my key questions was, is there value in creating an AI ethics board? And I'm not sure we've answered the question either way, because I think there's value in anything you do to try and drive transparency.
Should it just be your board?
So, well, and there is a reputational board as well. So, what is the difference? But the bit that I felt was absolutely critical is we already have governance processes that determine how we approach product development, launch of new products, sourcing of third-party suppliers, technology playbook on the rules we apply to how we deliver technology. Let's embed the principles in that. Because then every single individual and colleague that is actually developing anything new, be it technology, be it customer proposition, be it supplier source, code of conduct, will then have the point of reference of the awareness of, I need to understand that artificial intelligence as a technology has a potential and a power for harm or for good, and I need to have the right guidelines to know that I'm addressing this in the right way. So, ethics board versus embed it in every single decision-making process of the business?
Absolutely.
Where'd you take it?
Thanks for the questions. Got some phenomenal questions coming through. I'm going to elegantly try to weave these together and build on that point as well, Anna. So, and we're Jenny Tennyson, CEO of the Open Data Institute at the back there. Hi, Jenny. Thanks for that question. If you don't know, 2 weeks ago, the Government Office for AI, along with the ODI, and London Borough of Greenwich, I think it was, have announced the first data trust pilot as well. Jenny's question, which I guess, Anna, start with you, because obviously banking have been heavily involved in the open data debates recently. The question is, should ethical businesses share data they hold for public good and to increase diversity of data others can draw on to reduce bias? So, is there any learnings from the FS industry on that basis?
So I think we, some of the learnings we have from, so obviously, as you probably all know, we went through the Open Banking Competitions and Markets Authority desire to make sure that customers were entitled to share their data from other banks through apps that offered them that opportunity. And actually, the key learning point from that was, how do we make sure the customer understands what they're doing, what they're sharing, what the risks are, and therefore we empower the customer to make the decision of whether they want to do it or not. So it almost moves the debate away from should we use data or should we not, and moves it into the how do we tackle this question from the customer angle. How can we help the customer if we're going to share data? What is the benefit from the customer, and how do we should we actually approach this problem so that the customer is actually in control? So I think, from my perspective, and our starting point isn't whether we should or shouldn't. Obviously, there are clear lines of what we will never do, but actually it's more about how does doing this help the customer, and how do we do it in the best way possible. Yep. Collaboration, sharing data, providing more insight has very clear benefits, but it also has hidden or evident risks that we all need to be aware of.
And of all the sectors, just to double down on that point, Matteo, I mean, healthcare is barely out of the news on a weekly basis. There's been some incredibly high-profile issues in the last 2 years in particular with regards to patient data and the rest of that. You've spoken about your governance, etc., which sounds promising on first glance. So, what do we need to do to move this on? I mean, I keep thinking of this huge trade-off we have to kind of discuss with the public at large around the possibilities of unleashing the might of the NHS data set to these innovative, feisty startups, but the downside of impact on privacy and bias and security, etc.
It's enormous. I mean, there's a pragmatical problem, which is that the data set is mighty, but is also very heterogeneous and fragmented in different databases, stored with different record structures. So even if you got hold of it, it will take you probably 3 years to clean it up, which is our protection. The mess in the data protects the public. I think there is a problem. We're touching on what Anna was saying, which is that the issue is that on the one hand, we would like to have these fantastic data sets that we can use to be innovative. And the other one, you have GDPR, and privacy. And to be honest, we work with personal data, and we actually, as a company, we're working on something that we should launch in Q1 next year. We created a completely anonymous system. We basically asked ourselves, you were asking the question about the data, we asked ourselves, do we need people email addresses? And the answer is no, we don't. Because if they have our app on their phone, I can still communicate with them, and I don't need to know who they are. And so by completely removing the identity of the user, it makes our life a lot easier. We are less risky as a platform, and it builds trust with the users. But still, if you got the NHS data, if everything was anonymized, you look at Facebook, they can tell you more about yourself than your partner with like 6 likes. So if any data set, you would be able to somehow, at least for some people, be able to identify more or less who they are. I think that's very dangerous. So I think there needs to be some sort of standard. It'll be also there's competition, reasons why should I share my data with my competitors? We're a startup. I think that's a very, very gray area, and I'm not expecting major movements there for a while, to be honest.
Farney, you wanted to come in on
Yeah,
that?
it's an interesting one because we always say, yes, we would like to share because it'd be good to share data as much as possible, but at the same time, then of course we have GDPR and privacy. Now, there are 2 things in here. First of all is yes, we need to invest in and put research into really good anonymization techniques, because at the moment we don't. Anonymizing data is an extremely difficult thing to do, and de-anonymization, is really easy to de-anonymize data. But I think there is another discussion here that we need to have as part of all this. With the open data, if we say this, so the data is a common good in our societies, and we need as much as possible to inform, for example, public policy decisions. That's extremely useful. Then I think there is a discussion at some point we need to have around the concept of privacy. Now, I started my life as a privacy activist, but I've reached the conclusion now in 2018, after 20 years working in the field, that maybe the way that we've looked at privacy over the years is not conceivable in the age we're in. Maybe we need to start thinking about group privacy. Maybe we need to start thinking about, okay, we need this data so much, and having a new settlement with the public whereby we agree on what we're going to use the data for, but thinking in a society where we are, as Floridi normally says, we're not online or offline, we're somewhere in the middle all the time, we probably need to rethink the concept of individual privacy. And this is a debate that we need to have alongside the discussion on artificial intelligence, because it's just not thinkable anymore, I think, to focus on privacy the way we focus so far. And so if we want to consider data as a common good, at the same time, I think we have to revisit the concept of privacy, invest in researching anonymization techniques, as much as invest in researching in how to devise algorithms. These are big areas for research, but from a public debate, we really need to think about privacy.
And Ricardo, are you a privacy activist?
I'm very active in privacy.
Put that on a hashtag. Go ahead.
So a couple of comments here. On the one hand, on access to data as extremely important for the development of new technologies. Open government data initiatives, the possibility to discuss incentives for data sharing is something that should be on the agenda for policymakers. And another thing that might sound strange coming from a representative of a business, the opportunity to create data sets that can be accessed by small, medium enterprises, startups, so that they can benchmark their AI products and services with data sets that, according to the government and the public sector, are considered reliable, and so that have less biases, or that are good data sets to test their products with. This is part of the first remark on access to data. The second remark on rethinking privacy. If you look at privacy legislation around the world, all legislations, all laws have been inspired by the Fair Information privacy practices. So principles that have been for the past 40 years the global language for privacy. So I don't think we need necessarily to rethink the old concept of privacy, there are 8 principles in the Fair Information Privacy Principles. I understand that at the moment individual participation and the traditional model of notice and consent is challenged by artificial intelligence and new technologies. This is why we should look at all these principles as a more holistic system where we try to use more security safeguards, for instance, or accountability approaches as a way to counterbalance where we cannot really use consent in a meaningful way in the technology environment. And so in this way we can still provide enough protection to users and consumers. So I'm not disagreeing, I'm just saying that it's useful to build on what is already there. And there's a lot, and these principles have proved valid for 40 years. So
very good. Right, we're going to move up a gear. We've got 15 minutes remaining. I've got 25 questions on Slido, but I'm conscious I'm not going to get through all of them. If anyone's got an absolutely burning one, they want to put their hand up. Could you say who you are, unless you're a privacy activist? Introduce yourself for next question. Who hasn't had a go recently? Emma, or anyone else want to go first on that? Or Anna? Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
It's, I mean, so from the legal perspective, of course, the law is so far behind anyway, and I only come from this as a mother and married to a teacher, that we have to start right at the very bottom. Now, without getting too political, he works at a school where they've only just got a computer that's working. I mean, what the discussion we're having now and what's actually happening with our children are miles apart. Let's be realistic here. We're in a bubble in London. I mean, I don't live in London either, so I kind of tick all those boxes. But that's really where we have to start, because there are, with 2 tweenies, they haven't got a clue what's going on. They've got a phone because they need to have a phone because we need to track them, but they don't have an idea of how their data is really being used. We can have all these commitments in GDPR of consent, what that means. So, for instance, the school has set up an Instagram page. I haven't got any undertaking from the school that will be able to remove them permanently from the internet, because I know I won't be able to get it. But people are taking these decisions, in institutions that aren't particularly digitally literate or privacy literate, that will impact people for many, many years.
Absolutely.
And that's where I come from the legal perspective. I work at a tech law firm. Everyone who works there is there because they're interested in tech. But actually, we've got to go right back to the broader population.
Anna, did you want to address that?
Well, I was actually, it takes me back to a few years ago when we launched the Digital Eagles in Barclays, and it was exactly to that point, which is we sit in headquarters or in London, and we actually know the staff, or maybe think we know, but we don't kind of have it in detail. But actually, the couple of examples that we are pushing for as part of the efforts in sharing the AI learning and expertise is, one, arranging events. So we're actually doing that. We've had 34 this year. We're planning many more next year, where we try and connect people within communities, people in terms of startups, and also experts. Microsoft have been a great partner in that space. And we try and embrace topics in light of AI that are relevant. So we had one in Manchester around women in AI. We've had one in Norwich around sustainability and artificial intelligence. So that kind of movement of trying to engage as many in the broader community as possible is one angle. And then the other angle is really back to your point around schools. It sounds like a marketing campaign, but I promise it isn't. The other angle that we have is life skills. So one of the programs that we have is actually working with schools, and we volunteer with schools to actually give certain subjects where Barclays colleagues go to schools and help children write CVs or develop their interpersonal skills, etc. And we are looking at how do we drive the digital and more specific AI agenda in that sense, so that we can really contribute to the community in that way. So those are a couple of examples that we're working on.
And I think just a quick plug for another great event coming up at the end of January. So on that point, everyone have their responsible technology summit as well.
Yeah.
Specifically looking at that sort of societal impact and upskilling. We've got a few more minutes left for some questions. Anyone else got anything they want to really get off their chest? Or shall I revert back to Slido? I think we're out. Yes, please, sir.
I just got a brief comment on something that was discussed before.
Yeah.
My name's Jan Dowman and I chair a non-profit.
If you could broadcast to the back so they can hear as well.
Yeah, so I chair a non-profit which is concerned with trying to build cultures of integrity in business as a whole. A lot on IT, but it's not just focused on IT. It's just that there was a OECD and EBRD ethics summits recently, and both made the point that one of you made this. Let's make sure it's not a fad,
Yeah.
right? 80% of codes of conduct are just pieces of paper and are not operationalized in the day-to-day KPIs and operations of these companies. And there is this risk, which was mentioned earlier. So how do we get it into the day-to-day operational objectives of staff?
Yeah.
Right? That's not easy, but without it, you have nothing. Just
It's a great point. Yeah, I mean, I think the same thing applies. All the corporations I've worked for, where you're given your values to live by, whereas ideally you want to be co-creating those. How do we get that embedded bottom up throughout your workforce, so people are living and breathing that? So it's not just kind of a bit of paper that sits in a dusty shelf. Anyone want to go at that at all?
In startups, it's easier because it's a smaller environment. You do it by example, basically.
Yeah.
You make sure it comes from the top.
I mean, that's
And
we're assessed on whether we embody the values of our organisation.
Yeah.
So in our appraisal, it's linked. That's from the partners. now.
Compensation linked?
Yeah.
So
And as the gentleman said, you have to weave it into your day-to-day, so in the
Yeah.
decision making, and it's a good idea using it as a KPI. That's actually a very interesting point.
Yeah.
yeah, so can I just add to that? I think it's a good point. I think there are two things here. First of all, you have to sort of operationalize it as much as possible. So the principles that you decide that you want to use, you code them into the system. So you really make it, you really start to using an ethics as much as we've done with sort of privacy, and we do with privacy when we talk about privacy by design, and you make it ethical by design as much as you can, and that's one point. The other point is you run and probably it's easier in the public sector, so for example in local government or national government is about, so when you start talking about what are the values underpinning your AI strategy, or what are the values about, and you do it in the process, which is done with your employees, which is done with your communities, if you're a local authority. If you're a local authority and you start deploying artificial intelligence for some specific decision making, then you do have to consider how much am I involving my communities in what I'm doing. And the same within the staff, then there's a lot of training that needs to be done. There's a lot of but the more you involve your employees in the decisions that you're making, I think that the better it is.
But there's an interesting trend I've seen. So I think we're now the largest private sector recruiter of graduates in the country. And the interesting trends I've been seeing when we've been hiring staff now is the boots on the other foot.
Oh, yeah.
They're saying, you've got these purpose and values out here. I want to know how you actually embed those. So we're kind of, seeing that reversal happening with a far more sophisticated, set of talent out there who expecting you to live by what you stand for. It's not just about the biggest salary and the grandest brand anymore. I think people we're seeing, we're hiring, are tackling us on that. Christina, yeah.
Thanks, Rob. I think you mentioned...
Could you explain who you are, by the way?
Sorry, Christina Colclough. I work at Uni Global Union, which is the union federation. We represent 20 million people, and we do a lot of work on this. And one of the things that we see is that multinational companies outside of Europe, in their data policies, have actually the exact reverse of what we've been discussing here. We have, they require the rights to log personal data, sensitive data. Trade union membership is often a separate category. And I think, we have a big obligation in Europe to actually take the GDPR, the goodness of the GDPR,
totally.
and expand that globally. Because, it's quite hair-raising reading to read these global policies, which are contrary to what you have all been talking about. So, I mean, not only is that, a competition aspect, it's also, of course, social and human rights. What I'd like to add is on your ethics councils or data councils you've been talking about, please include the workers
Totally.
in that.
Agree.
I mean, not many of you have explicitly said that, but this is something we're pushing for. We call them data and AI governance boards. And that would also address actually a weakness in the GDPR, which is there's no direct requirement of accountability from management to the workers. So I think if we really, and as Rob is saying, that the young generation coming in, they have higher ideals, well, let's match that. Let's do that already now by creating this multi-stakeholder governance boards in the company.
Totally.
Thanks, Christina. Does anyone want to respond to that? Or
I would completely, I would.
I think we'll all
We agree.
All agree.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, there are various tools that workers can use if they feel that they're allowed to use them. That's about building the environment within a workforce, similar to sexual harassment claims. You can actually bring concerns around. So there are tools within GDPR. It's more around whether you create an environment around that, I think. I think what's really interesting is as we move to become more cybersecurity and to monitor networks and assets, then there does, privacy concerns are raised because all of a sudden people become assets on the network, right? And it's that's what we're really starting to look at and helping companies try and work through, where the fine line is with that.
Hilary.
Hilary Sutcliffe from Society Inside, which is a riff on Intel Inside, actually, about how people and planet should be at the heart of innovation. So I'm old. I've been having these conversations about ethics in corporations since the 1980s.
Yeah.
And worker boards, Jesus, how long will we be talking about worker representations on boards? And so, we go this time and time again. I wrote BT's ethics principles in 1995.
They're still in place?
Sorry?
They're still in place? Or?
I've no idea, but I did it myself.
Not in Italy.
But why do you think we're not learning? I actually don't really understand, with all the pressure, all the time and time again, we still don't seem to do it. And I don't really understand, apart from humans being humans like that.
Here.
Absolutely.
I don't think we're going to disagree with that. Tom?
I want an answer.
Sorry.
by the way.
Oh, yeah. We don't want to...
But I agree with you. I mean, that's, it's true. It's true. We've said it over and over again. I mean, I think what's been, I don't know, I mentioned it before, but what's been really interesting in 2018 has been to look at globally how employees have been taking a stand, and I thought it's been amazing. I mean, it's been really good, hasn't it? So for example, so really challenging, and this is happening in the US, even challenging the decisions of what their companies were using AI for. Really challenging it and say, well, we're not part of it, and walking out of business, really. And we've seen this, and I think, so this activism of employees in the US, I think this has changed the perception at global level that when it comes to technology, then, we have to be together defining what technology is for. And I wonder whether this big change happened. I mean, there is a fantastic report, I don't know, Rob, if you read it, it's the AI Now report, which has come out last week. It's brilliant. Yeah. And I really recommend it. And it's about it's exactly what you're talking about.
And there was something in the opening keynotes as well, that just one slide from that report you look at is simply what's happened in the last 12 months.
Oh, fantastic.
It's just a beautiful graphic that just shows all these things that have, in the main, quite bad things, admittedly, rather than good breakthroughs.
Absolutely.
But Tom, can I just ask you for one very brief final question before I ask the panel to sum up? Can you introduce yourself?
It's a bit of a can of worms. Are you sure you
Oh my God, we've only got 4 minutes left.
Okay, very quickly. Tom Carr, Agent Technologies. It's more of a question which is more from a personal perspective, company perspective. I kind of feel this conversation has been awfully Eurocentric. We've come that we are right and that absolutely our value system is going to prevail. But this is not like when we wrote the UN Declaration of Human Rights back in the 40s and 50s, where bluntly, yes, you wrote a Western-centric version of things could apply. When I look at competition, Shenzhen is where an awful lot of the big stuff is happening. And bluntly, the concept of privacy rights out there is very different. We are not going to be able to apply a notion of privacy that we can't get. How much would any of us in this room think is right? I think the panel done a great job of discussing it. So the final thing I'd ask the panel is, how do we apply our set of privacy in a world where it will simply not become the standard and it will compete with other competing notions of how privacy and ethics are applied in technology?
And that's a great question. And a few of us were here in Toronto at the UK-Canada colloquium 2 weeks ago, and Professor Dame Wendy Hall raised a similar point, and she posits this fragmentation of the internet that John Thornhill from the FT wrote up this week about, could you have the Chinese system breaking off, the bourgeois European system and the commercial system in the US. Great report by John Thornhill, I should add. Anyone want to address this Eurocentricity issue?
Being Italian,
Being
I
Italian.
would say, being Italian, I would say, when in Rome, do as the Romans. So if you want to do business in China, go and do it their way.
I mean, it's been raised, hasn't it?
And
with
if you don't like it, don't do it.
the autonomous vehicles, because the MIT have just picked up on it, because the data set that they're using for the autonomous vehicles obviously doesn't take into account developing countries. Now, someone's turned around and said, well, that's probably all right anyway, because their roads are different, and they're probably that's many, many years ago. I think we are probably, it goes back to being in a bubble. I don't think there is a solution. I think that's what we will end up.
Can I just...
I would just say that actually being aware of those differences has to be a first step. So making sure that we're reminded that we are Europe-centric is a really good first step. The second aspect would be, who are your customers and what are you doing it for? And if it's approved by your customers, move it forward that way. But being aware and knowing what other people are, where they're different, will help us.
Just briefly, Ivana.
Yeah, I just think the question is good, but I think that it's about the deal that you have with citizens, isn't it, in the end? If your data, when I say we have to rethink the concept of privacy, this is exactly what I mean. It's not just in terms of competition. That your citizens will say, yes, I'm happy with my data to be shared to increase my life expectancy, to improve health. They would be much less happy to share data if, for example, we've seen with the Cambridge Analytica, if you used to manipulate elections. So I think what I'm saying is that probably you're right. There is some rethinking that we have to do about privacy, not just for competition, but also because of the way their society is, the way that we live, and the way that we actually want better health outcomes. We want better informed public policy decisions based on data. We want better transport. We want more safety. So if we want all that, then probably we do have to rethink the way we conceive privacy. And it's not just a matter of competition, it's a matter of where technology is at.
Brilliant. Okay, we've beautifully reached the final 2 minutes. I see Anthony hovering at the back there. Panelists, very, very briefly, can you give me one thing businesses in the room should do, or one thing we need government to give us to ensure that business ethics is progressed positively throughout 2019? Anna?
Look at ethics through the lens of your customers and focus on what's the value exchange and how you're going to move them forward.
If you haven't already done so, review your data sets and the reason for you collecting them and retaining them, and follow the commitments you've made to your customers and your employees.
For government, I think to create a strict framework to protect competition, to avoid the VAT loopholes that Amazon used in the 90s to destroy the book industry. And
we haven't got time for tax today.
Yeah. They were not. They were paying 3% tax in Luxembourg, where everybody else pays 20%. So we need frameworks to move very fast because the technology moves very fast. So you need protection for a level ecosystem. Otherwise, the big guys are going to eat everybody for breakfast.
Ivana?
Decide what ethics means for your organization, who you need to involve in all this, and deploy an algorithm impact assessment to look at the algorithms that you use, and have ethics audits to make sure that somebody external comes and look into the processes that you're using.
Beautifully background. Penultimate word, Ricardo.
Yeah, and the last one has to be very comprehensive.
Move to Italy,
and
clearly.
Move to Italy
Yeah.
if you, because we are taking over, because we are taking over AI ethics. No, certainly is just an encouragement for companies to embrace accountability approaches, and so to minimize risks and all themselves accountable for all the impacts and unintended consequences that technology can bring to citizens.
And final word from me, follow me on Twitter @RobMcCargo for the latest cutting edge breakthroughs on AI ethics in business. Can I just say thank you to Anna, Emma, Matteo, Ivana and Ricardo for a brilliant panel. Thank you very much for your time.